Well, it's a tremendous pleasure to be joining you this afternoon, especially with such an eminent and fun guest as Jennifer here. Jennifer comes to be in Arkansas through an initiative of the Arkansas Symphony Orchestra that has a very grandiose title. We call it the Composer of the Year Initiative. But really what it is it's an idea of getting to know a composer in a much more substantive way over all of our series. So this season, many of you will have already come to know Jennifer's works in our chamber series, at our chamber orchestra series, the new Inc. concert series, Intermittent Neighborhood concert series, and then of course this week on our Masterworks series. So this is how we have come to bring Jennifer here this week, but it's a tremendous coup for the orchestra and something that I'm particularly pleased to be doing in Arkansas, in that Jennifer, as Skip already referred, is truly one of the great foremost composers working in the field today. If you look back at Jennifer's past, it is just quite an extraordinary resume. I'm just going to tell you a few little things, just some bullet points. She has been commissioned by some of the great orchestras of the world, including the Atlanta Symphony, the Philadelphia Orchestra, the Cleveland Orchestra, the London Philharmonic Orchestra. Her compositions have been performed by many of the great orchestras around the world, and great artists around the world have won a Grammy Award. Hilary Hahn has championed her 2010 violin concerto, for which she won the Pulitzer Prize. So with that, I'd like to welcome to Arkansas and to the Arkansas Symphony as well, Jennifer Higdon.
Thank you, Maestro.
It's also a tremendous personal pleasure for me to have her in town here because we're friends and we go back a ways in the business as well. And so I'm going to start you off not with a softball question.
Throw it at my head, Philip.
I'm going to, and by the way, before we really launch into this, if you have a follow-up question, if you think something is really resonating with you, feel free to raise your hand and we'll call on you and we'll keep the conversation going. There'll also be some time for questions towards the end for just a question-answer period.
And I will also answer on behalf of all composers throughout history, Beethoven, Mozart, and such. So if there's something you're wondering about the process or how it all happens, I'll answer on their behalf.
Well, it's funny you said that because that's what I'm going to hit you with for this first question, which is the question I get from people around Arkansas. We've got 300 years of great music, Mozart, Beethoven, all the way through Brahms, Strauss, Wagner, Stravinsky, Shostakovich now. Why do we need Jennifer Higdon?
Well, it sounds like from your list we need a woman in there somewhere, first of all. I think one of the things I love the most about art in general, and the thing that I feel passionately about with music, is the fact that it's music of our time. So it reflects our experience. It reflects the energy, kind of the questions we have, the thoughts we have today. This is a very different world than Beethoven lived in. That probably doesn't need saying, but we often don't think about the fact that Beethoven, when he was writing his wonderful symphonies or his piano concertos, he didn't have the hum of a modern world. There was no electricity. For him, sound was the clip-clop of horses' hooves going along a road. People yelling, maybe drunk or something, down below his apartment window. I thought about this when I visited Vienna a couple of years ago. I thought, wow, the world must have sounded very different for Beethoven. And then when you think about the fact that he went deaf on top of it, but even when he was at his best hearing, it's a different sounding world. And I think people now, and our musicians now, who are at such an extraordinary level of performing, better than they have been at any point in history. The players now are just incredible. They deserve their own music. I don't see why we don't do things for the musicians and the audiences and speak to our times, our experiences, the things that we reflect on, we experience together. Beethoven did it, Mozart did it, Stravinsky did it, Copland. And it's about time a woman got in there and did it, I think.
That's a very interesting point that you bring up about the incredible talents and abilities of modern musicians. It's often said in the orchestra world that the quality of orchestral playing has never been higher in the history of the art form, and there are lots of statistics that would back that up. If you look in China right now, there are 11 million piano students just in China. So if you think of the quantity of talent that right now is out there studying, it also permeates up into the orchestra world. Does that offer for you particular opportunities or maybe even challenges in writing for this new virtuosity that is permeating the entire field?
For me, actually, that is an inspiration. I'm lucky in that I write with some of the most extraordinary musicians in mind. One of those Chinese pianists, Yu Zhuang, premiered my piano concerto. Composers throughout history have had a tendency to push the boundaries. We like to imagine sound and manipulating sound in writing music, and we tend to imagine things beyond what the normal level of playing is at a given time, and usually what happens is the players take the music, they look at it and they go, oh my, this is really hard. They always talk about how difficult it is, but then they learn it, and that helps pushing the level, basically, pushes the level of playing skill forward, pushes it up. And so I've found it very inspiring to be able to work with extraordinary musicians, and I've worked with some really incredible soloists and orchestras, and it's kind of funny, the Concerto for Orchestra, which the symphony is doing this weekend, is a perfect example. When the Philadelphia Orchestra premiered that piece, the musicians at first were like, oh, this is really difficult, and I know it's difficult, you got to practice, you're a musician, that's your job. And so after about a day of rehearsal, the players started coming up to me and they started telling me the stories of when they played in the Philadelphia Orchestra the first time they did the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra. Which, when I look at the Bartók and I look at my Concerto for Orchestra, mine's actually more difficult. It's much more virtuosic, it requires much more detailed playing and probably a higher level actually than the Bartók. But it was interesting to talk to these people who'd given the first performances of the Bartók and were excited to be doing a new piece, and they told me it actually was harder than the Bartók, but I loved hearing their stories about premiering. In fact, one of the string players got lost during the Bartók, and he leaned over to his stand partner and he said, just use your bow, point to the music. Don't do anything to show the maestro, I don't know where I am, but point with your bow. So I thought that it was such a cool thing to have that kind of connection to history. But then you realize when you're creating music, you are a part of that realm, and then will be, hundreds of years of other people doing the same sort of thing.
We had a similar moment in rehearsal last night where the third horn got lost. And I saw the entire brass section point over to show him right where we were in the music. And that is a mark of really fine composition often, in that it's pushing the boundaries. You think of the Brahms Violin Concerto or the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, these great works that were dubbed unplayable at the time, that now are centerpieces of the entire repertoire. We have a follow-up question here, and if you'll just wait just for a moment for a microphone, thank you so much.
Why is it difficult? What makes it difficult?
That's a good question. Usually what happens is we get to know the players when we're writing for them, and we know the kinds of repertoire they play, and our imaginations run wild. That's the most basic answer. And when I was writing my violin concerto for Hilary Hahn, I remember thinking, boy, Hilary can play absolutely anything. She really seems like she can play anything. And she kept pushing me to write a piece that was harder. With each movement that I sent her, you can make it harder, you can make it harder. This is like throwing the gauntlet down for a composer, which basically it equals more notes, the instruments pushed to the extreme, either the high or the low, more intricate rhythms. Now, I'm a big fan of pulse, a recognizable pulse. I think a listener should be able to come to a concert, not have a PhD in the music, and be able to understand everything that's going on. I think that's imperative. But I also believe you have to make it work for the instruments, because if the musicians believe in the music, if they feel good about what they're playing, if they feel good about what they've spent hours practicing, they will really give you so much. It's amazing. And so my imagination runs wild, and because the piece that's being done is a concerto for orchestra, when we write a concerto, we're usually doing that to show off the skill of the individual at the front of the room. That's the idea. When you're writing a concerto for orchestra, you're showing off the entire orchestra. It's a little different than, say, the Beethoven Violin Concerto or the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto. You're now giving the more difficult material to everybody who is sitting in that group. So that means principal players will have solos, it means sections will have solos, but it kind of ups the ante a little bit.
It seems like this might be a good opportunity for us to talk a little bit about the work that we will hear this week with the symphony. And Jennifer's Concerto for Orchestra is one in a long line of concerto for orchestra traditions. The Bartók has already been mentioned today as one of the great centerpieces of the repertoire. Lutoslawski wrote a very powerful one. Joan Tower wrote one in 1992, I think. Mm-hmm. And it's something that showcases the virtuosity of the individual members of the orchestra. And one of the things that's quite striking from the very outset of Jennifer's work is that it doesn't just focus on the traditional places where the virtuosity is found in an orchestra, the violin section, or in the principal horn or principal trumpet. It showcases all of the second instruments. It showcases the percussion section. It showcases other parts of the percussion section.
I don't know if the percussionists want you to say they're second instruments, though. If there's anyone around with a drumstick, it could come flying your way.
Well, I mean like flute, the principal flute or the second flute.
The second flute.
The third flute piccolo. Yeah. The third trombone has little solos. The tuba has solos. It truly, I think, I was hoping to have you talk a little bit more about this, what made you decide to really showcase all of these previously unheralded musicians? I mean, it's one thing when you're writing for the Philadelphia Orchestra, but
right.
there must also be a risk there involved where you're asking to put in the spotlight people who normally aren't.
Like the principal second violin, which I think I've had 3 orchestras with the principal second violin said, "Why are you doing this to me? I've never had a solo in my life."
And it's a big, very hard solo.
I think it's actually maybe harder than the concertmaster's solo. This comes about when you know your players. Because I live in Philadelphia, I live a couple of blocks from the hall. When I got the commission, it was announced, there was a 2-year gap between the announcement and the actual premiere. Because I walk in the same area where they all rehearse and perform, they started stopping me on the street and asking for solos. During the 2 years, and you know, who am I going to tell Philadelphia Orchestra members, no, you can't have a solo? So that's actually how this got started. It began, I think it was the flute player said to me, listen, I want a solo that's really up high, you know, I have this great tone up high, so I dutifully wrote that down on a little piece of paper, and then the oboe player came to me. There was a whole series of requests. Now, I realized at some point that there were so many requests that I was going to have to make like a shopping list and actually check off the solos as I wrote them. But in a way, this kind of suggested the design of the piece, because what I ended up doing, it's a 5-movement work. I wrote the 3rd movement first. That's the movement that has most of the solos in it. And it was the idea of highlighting the principal players. But I also realized that a principal player is nothing without their section. So I made sure that the flute has a solo, but then the other flute players join in. And you highlight the section. It also gives the audience a chance to hear their respective flute section, their oboe and English horn players, the clarinet, the 3 bassoons, which in this case is actually, you know, it also has contrabassoon. And so it was the request. That was the first thing. The timpanist of the Philadelphia Orchestra, this is unusual. Most people don't know this. A timpanist usually does not play in the percussion section. I think it may be a union rule or something, but they stay on the timpani. But the timpanist I know very well in Philly, and he said to me, I really want to play percussion. And I thought, can you do that? So I went to the administration of Philly Orchestra and said, look, your timpanist is really wanting to play in the percussion section. He was like a little kid wanting to play with all the toys. And so they said, well, sure, why not? So that gave me the idea to do an entire movement of just the percussion, because I thought, well, all right, the timpanist, I need him for the rest of the piece, but I could have him run over to the percussion section, play, and then at the end of that movement run back to the timpani. So it was the request, you know, and I have found through the years that the musicians will ask you for specific things. If you say, what do you want in your concerto? They'll actually give you like a list of things. It's like ordering a car. You know, it's like the percussion concerto I wrote. You know, the percussionist wanted a piece with, you know, a lot of marimba in it, but he also wanted to play drums, and he wanted to play little percussion instruments, and he also wanted to play vibraphone. So you make lists, and you figure out ways to make it happen. And then you just kind of daydream a lot. That's the other thing. What sounds good with this, you know? The second movement is just strings, because I'd always heard about the Philadelphia string sound. And so knowing that, I thought to myself, I should do one movement just for strings. But then when I was sitting there daydreaming one day, I thought to myself, what would it be like to get the string section of the Philly Orchestra to do this thing called a snap pits at the end? All of them. They pull the string on the instrument very hard so that it snaps back on the fingerboard. It's a great sound. It's also known as a Bartok pits. But I decided before I started that movement that I wanted at the end a snap hits, because I just wanted to hear all the Philadelphia strings do a snap hit.
On their $1 million instruments.
Exactly, but you know what? It sounds awfully good on $1 million instrument. But that's kind of, it's strangely enough, it comes from requests that you get to know the performers. You get to figure out what they would like. The tuba player wanted a short solos, so that's why there are a bunch of short brass solos in there. There was actually a request by the tuba player. So I try to tailor the piece to fit the ensemble. And then I know that the level of playing is so good in the United States that the piece will transfer well to other places, which it has done. So it's been kind of an amazing journey to watch the piece grow. And for me, even though it's only 11 years old, this piece feels young to me. Because it was early in my career. This was the piece that launched my career. So I have a very kind of sentimental feeling about it as well.
It seems like everyone in the orchestra has a voice in this piece. It's a particularly democratic work, considering the surroundings here today. And I must say that standing on the podium, watching it play out, there's quite a ballet involved, where you see the timpanist travail, climbing down from the podium there over into the percussion section, and seeing all of this mechanism work. Jennifer's had an opportunity to work and have roots in the South, in Tennessee, in Georgia. Here we are in Arkansas, and I'm curious if you have found that there are particular challenges or opportunities in writing music to be successful with Southern audiences. Perhaps it's the same experience, or maybe it's something different from what you experienced in Philadelphia.
It's a good question. It actually is pretty much the same experience. The difference is I have more fun talking to the people in the South because they want to come up and chat, which I love, having grown up in the South. I have, on occasion, used certain aspects of growing up in the South, writing a bluegrass concerto. I've done that, and I'm currently working on an opera on Charles Fraser's book, Cold Mountain. So I have noticed as I'm writing that my Southernness is coming out. It's such a huge project to take on an opera. It's a huge project, but the music is coming more naturally to me than anything I have ever written. And so when I had to write mountain music, and I needed to write Southern fiddling, it happened so easily. I was kind of amazed by the experience, but I was also very grateful. I think audiences everywhere they're open. They're hungry for something so long as it's engaging and exciting. And I always am endeavoring, when I write, I think about the fact that you have paid to come to a concert, and it is my responsibility from the very first note to hold your attention right through to the end. I think that is a very important thing for me. And when I'm composing, I ponder that constantly. I mean, literally every day. I write every day. I will write somewhere between 4 to 6 hours a day, although now that I'm on the opera, I'm writing about 8 to 9 hours a day. But at every moment while I'm working, I sit there and think to myself, is this interesting enough? Is there something I need to do with the music that will make it more interesting? And usually there are things that I can improve, but I'm constantly testing the material. Is this engaging enough? Do we need a new color? Do I need to do something shocking here? So it's kind of a good litmus test. I think it's the friendliness of the South maybe that has led me along this path. It's like your neighbor moves in and you go over and, can I get you anything? You need a cup of sugar or something? It's a similar thing in my composing. It's being neighborly to all the fellow musicians and all the people who are going to show up in the audience.
Well, it's very interesting to hear you talk about this role that you see as keeping an audience member's attention for the duration of a work or for a performance. What do you see as the broader role of the work, beyond just the entertainment or creative or inspirational value that one receives as being part of a performance event? Putting on your big composer hat for a moment, what do you see as the broader role of living composers right now writing in contemporary society?
Oh, that's a good question. You know what? I never stop and think about that. Maybe because I'm so busy writing. I am aware that because there are not as many women composers, that I have a responsibility for young women coming up, that in a certain sense I can be a role model. And I think also giving voice to young performers. I mean, I've also, in addition to writing the Philly Orchestra, I've also written things for junior high band and junior high choir, because I think that's important. This is where it starts. But you know what? I often take the opinion that the musicologists and the theorists can decide that sort of thing, and it's just my job to write the best music I can. And if it's meant to last, it'll last, and if it doesn't, that's okay, so long as people have enjoyed it. That's the most important thing.
One of the things that's striking to me about learning your music and learning the scores is how emotionally affecting it can be at times. And knowing the history behind some of the works, you must be bringing a great deal of your own personal experience and personal history to the composition of the work, and whether it's narrative in fashion or emotional material that you use. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your personal influences before we talk about your bigger professional influences, what you personally have brought to the table when you sit down to write something.
Well, I think of music as a very emotional experience as a listener. The pieces that we all love, the ones that really hit us at the heart, that you remember the first time you heard a specific piece, it's hard to explain what that is. What is it in a piece? You can't really teach that to a student. And it's also, I think it's probably impossible to explain. But I know that for every musician that you ask, there's some seminal concert or a work that they heard somewhere at some point that made them go, oh, I want to be a musician. Or they think to themselves, oh, I'm always going to go to the symphony. I remember when I was 8 years old and I heard this piece or that. Maybe it was Beethoven, it might have been Beethoven 9, it might have been Stravinsky's Firebird Suite. I think knowing how important the emotional experience is in the music, to me, it's very important that I figure out a way to communicate emotion in the music. Now, for composers, this is a different thing. Some people don't think of it as emotion. They're like, well, I've got the theory here, and it needs to go here, and it needs to go here. But for me, it's an emotional experience. It's tricky, though, trying to figure out how to translate that onto the page. And part of the way I learn how to do it, and I tell my students this all the time, go to an orchestra concert, go to any concert, watch the audience. You'll know when the composer has lost the audience. You can see it happen because there's movement, there's a lot of movement, and people start looking at their watch and the program and sometimes their phone, and they're checking all kinds of, they're not paying attention. But I've often told my students that's the best way to learn about what works in music. Watch the audience. That'll tell you. If you talk as a composer to musicians who've played, ask them, is this working? Does this feel right to you? And they'll often volunteer that even without you asking. But it's true. But I kind of value that because to me it's kind of, I'm also taught by the audience and the musicians. But there have been on occasions where I've been writing a piece where there was some sort of emotional story involved. Back in 1998, my younger brother passed away from cancer. And I was kind of amazed at how cathartic it was to write music after that. I mean, it occurred to me, he passed away from cancer, and it was between the diagnosis and his death, it was only 7 weeks. It struck me very deep within my core that it's very important to do things that matter, and that music is a great way to speak to people. It's a great way to kind of get the experience out there. But also for me, it was dealing with that, knowing the power of music and how I've seen it heal a lot of people. I just kind of put my head down and started composing. And I realized the importance that I be very adamant about that sort of thing. I actually make my living from writing. I teach only 2 hours a week at Curtis. It's not very much. I have been offered jobs, full-time teaching jobs in places, but I've actually turned them down because I think about my brother Andrew. And I think about the importance of doing something for others. And to me, making music that speaks is the most incredible experience. How you do that, I don't really know. But as you know, my most performed orchestra piece is Blue Cathedral, which I think at this point has probably had between 400 and 500 performances. This was a piece that was written after my brother passed away. It was commissioned by the Curtis Institute for its 75th anniversary. And it's a piece, I never thought about this, but it's a piece that gets done a lot. It's amazing, and I'm always stunned by the number of people who come up who will even just take my hands after performance and they can't say anything. And to me, that is the ultimate compliment. You know that you've struck a chord. But I also feel like for music, that's what music is about. It's about the soul singing, to put it very simply. So I think we prompted a question over here.
Very beautifully put.
The microphone is coming your way. Hold your thought. Here you go.
Thanks for coming out today. So I have 2 questions, and one is you were talking about your composing. What is the process you usually go through? You know, are you sitting and you think, oh, this melody sounds beautiful? Or are you sitting and thinking, what is this chord structure I'm going to be working with? And then my next question is, how do you think that compares with, let's say, what Mozart was doing?
Ooh,
and then my next question is...
Wait, is that 3? Wait, maybe you should let me answer the first part of that, because that's actually big, and then we'll go to your next question. Would that be all right?
Okay.
So just hold on one second. The process, I'm actually lucky in that I'm always writing for specific musicians. I think since I was in grad school, I've had commissions. And up until I started the opera a year ago, I was doing probably between 8 and 12 pieces a year, which is a lot. It's a whole lot. But because I'm working for musicians who can usually articulate what they want, and because I usually get to know the instrument or the ensemble, maybe if it's piano trio or something, I sit there and daydream and try to come up with stuff. I never think, I should be careful. Are there any theory teachers in here before I make this next statement? I never think theoretically. Oh, no tomatoes came. Okay, so we're in the clear. I actually don't think about harmonic progressions and such. I think about coming up with a melody, and I think this is because I'm a flute player. Because I started out on a single line instrument, I tend to think line by line. I try to come up with interesting melodies, but melodies that fit whatever the instrument is I'm writing for. When I was writing for violin and piano, I tried to think about violin and piano. And then I try to find other lines that will be interesting with it. Now, sometimes it is a chord progression, but I've had a tremendous amount of theory training in school. I have like 4 degrees. It's like way too much, too many degrees to have in one's head. I spend the rest of my life trying to get out from under my degrees and let my brain do the composing. I actually try to get out of the way and just come up with things that I think are interesting. One of my teachers once said in a lesson, you know, Jennifer, the most important thing is what it sounds like in the end. That's the key test. It's not whether someone can analyze it, but what does it sound like in the end? And I thought, well, geez, if that's the way I should be going, maybe I should start from that process. So I compose from my ear. Now, that's backed up with a lot of theory training and having studied a lot of scores, but it does come down to something that simple. It sometimes surprises me. People will take my pieces, they will analyze them, they'll do like doctoral dissertations on the pieces, and they find all of these things, and they come to me and they're like, of course you meant to do this chord here, and it went here, and of course you had like this form here, and they're looking at me and I'm looking at it, and they're like, you meant that, right? And I'm like, no, I didn't know that was there, actually. And they often have this look like, really? But I have found that following my instinct with the knowledge that I have helps me to get to, I think, a better product. Does that answer your first question? I think Beethoven and Mozart thought that way too, because if you think about it, those guys didn't have theory. They had counterpoint exercises that they were also performers, and you learn a lot as a performer about composing. Most performers don't know that. They always think, oh, I couldn't compose. But I used to make kids at Curtis compose all the time, the performers, and they were like, oh, I can't do it, I can't do it. But then they would write, and then we would perform the pieces, and they sounded great. So it's an interesting balancing act for anyone who creates anything, trying to figure out how much is learned, how much is already within inside you, and how to get out of your own way, to get your brain to be quiet. So your other question, you want to...
And it sounds like the next question that's coming may be composition related. So I'm going to interject, if it's okay, for just a moment and ask you...
Do you have a question,
I have another
Maestro?
follow-up question.
Okay, yes,
Which is, since we're talking about the actual process of composition, could you paint us a picture of what your composing setup looks like? Do you have a studio? Are you someone that can do it on an airplane? Can you sit in a hotel room and write? What does it look like when you sit down and open up some manuscript paper and start to write? Or do you do it on a laptop?
I actually do a combination of writing and manuscript books, also blank drawing notebooks that you would buy if you were doing sketches. And I also use a computer. I use all three. I have a studio. I do most of my writing in the studio now. I used to be able to write on the road all the time in airports and in hotels. In fact, I have pieces where the Concerto for Orchestra is one of them where I can remember in each movement what the view was outside my hotel window. Seriously, that piece had I think I was in 4 different parts of the United States while I was writing the second movement. And as we go through, I always see the view out the window. But I have a studio that has like a piano behind the computer. You can swivel the chair around, and I will go back and forth between the piano. I'm a terrible pianist, first of all, but I can find chords, I can find things. And then I have a music notation program. I use Finale. And so, but still some of this is actually just with manuscript paper. So I will sketch ideas, things I think, well, this might work. I'll give you an idea. Actually, the opera I'm working on is such a huge project that I have 4 notebooks for this thing. Early on, last year when I started the opera, I think it was at the end of January, this melody came to me, and I could not figure out where the melody went. It had a really cool chord progression. It defied all the rules that I had been taught in theory, but it sounded cool. So I wrote it down, and I thought, okay, I've got 2.5 hours of music. I can find a place where this is supposed to fit, but I truly didn't know. The librettist had not finished the second act. I didn't know, was it first act, second act? So last week, I discovered, after having written the whole first act of the opera, that it actually fits in the second act. Now, I was recently given the libretto by the librettist, and I started looking at this one section he had, and I pulled out that melody, and the words actually fit the melody. Now, I had written the melody a whole year before, and I'm thinking, how could this be? Now, I was really suspicious of this. I mean, even though I wrote it and it fit, I thought, well, maybe my brain is trying to superimpose this material. And so I took it to the librettist. I wrote out the words with the music, and I took it to him, and I said, will you take a look at this and see if you think this works? I didn't explain to him that the melody was an entire year old, because I thought, well, let's see what he really thinks. So he played it. He says, oh, that worked. That's great. I'm so glad you wrote this for this section of my words. And I'm like, well, actually, I wrote the music a year ago, and I've just put your words in here. And I don't know where this stuff comes from. I know that sounds strange, but it's part of the mystery of the creative process. I do an extraordinary amount of sketching, but at some point, usually when I get going on the piece, and beginning a piece is a nightmare. Anyone who's around me for like the week or two where I'm starting a piece will know I'm in a really bad mood because I can't figure out what's supposed to happen. Every time I think, I can't remember how to write. Are they crazy? They're going to discover I have no idea what I'm doing. I say this to myself all the time. And usually after a week or two of this agonizing and banging my head on the piano keyboard, something comes up and I think, oh, that might work. And it's usually a very square-sounding idea, something that's not interesting at all. And then I start moving the notes around. I'll try different things on the piano. I'll write them down in the manuscript. Sometimes if there are a lot of lines and I can't play it on the piano, I'll enter it into the computer. And then I'll start looking at it, and then maybe 2 other notes will add themselves. They'll say, I think this needs to be a C and a D, and I'll write that down. And so I have my computer set up not to play like an orchestra, but just it sounds like a piano playing. I'm not technologically advanced enough to figure out how to get the thing to play like an orchestra like all my students can, but that's okay. So far I'm doing all right in the composing thing. But what happens is you just start adding notes, and after a while it starts to add up. Strangely enough, but half of the idea is I don't really know where this stuff comes from, and I'm often stunned when I hear it, like coming from an orchestra. I think, my gosh, how did I write that? This is one of the hardest things about creativity. This concerto for orchestra is 32 minutes, 33 minutes, and if you had told me I was going to write that piece and I was going to have something like 60,000 notes in it, I would have been like, oh, there's no way. I mean, that sounds really intimidating, right? 60,000 notes in a piece? But the thing is, I did it one note at a time. It's exactly the same way Beethoven did it, Mozart, Bach, Higdon, one note at a time. I read something recently about mountain climbing. The Sherpas talked about going up Mount Kilimanjaro. They start for the final climb to the summit at like midnight, 1 a.m. The reasoning is that you go out, and it's very dark, of course. You have a headlamp on, and you can only see the spot right in front of you on the ground. They said they've discovered if they actually start before the sun comes up, the people are okay. They just focus on the spot on the ground. They take a step, and they take another step. They take another step and another. Eventually, they get to the top. When they actually start groups going up in the daylight, they can see the distance and the steepness of what they have to climb, and they said they almost never summit. And I've always thought to myself, that's like composing. If you can't look at the entire picture. When I thought about writing an opera in 2.5 hours of music and the responsibility to Charles Fraser to take care of Cold Mountain, it was so overwhelming. But then I realized, if I just start on the first minute of music, if I could just get through the first minute, then I can go to the second minute. That will make a full scene. I will have a scene. It'll be 4 or 5 minutes. Then I'll go to the next scene. And the next thing I knew, after 1 year of writing, I had a full act. I had an hour and 15 minutes of music. When I look back, though, I'm kind of intimidated by that. I think, how did I get to this point? I'm stunned by it, actually. But it's those little steps. Can you hold your question a second while is it a mountain climbing question?
I want to know how you evolved musically.
Oh,
what led up to what you did?
Wow, yeah, it's a good question. I have a really unusual background. I started really late. I picked up a flute when I was in high school. My mom had a flute sitting in the attic that wasn't getting played, and I taught myself to play from a beginning band method book, which also explained the treble clef and how you finger each of the notes. So I think I started off with Mary Had a Little Lamb. I'm pretty sure that was the first tune. But I taught myself to play, and we didn't have classical music in my household. My dad was an artist working at home. We had rock and roll, 60s folk, Peter, Paul, and Mary, a lot of the Beatles, Rolling Stones, Bob Marley. There was a lot of reggae, but really not much classical music. Occasionally you would hear something coming from a studio that might be like the local station. And I decided during high school that I wanted to major in music. Now, when I think back to what I didn't know, which was pretty much everything, I knew nothing. I went to Bowling Green State University in Ohio, and I entered. I'm sure my flute teacher thought, oh boy, she knows 3 pieces on the flute. Much to her credit, though, she didn't discourage me. And I must have come in charging, saying, all right, I'm going to do this. But I placed in all the most basic elementary classes. You take placement exams, and I ended up, we called it dummy theory, dummy solfege, basic piano for the person who's never seen a piano, that kind of thing. But the thing was, I kept at it. I kept learning. I knew I needed to learn a lot, but I don't think I realized how much I did know. And so I just worked my way through the classes. I was always behind all of my classmates. They were all like, oh yeah, the Bach this, the Beethoven that. And I'm like, who? What? Who's that? And so I kind of worked my way through. I was getting a flute performance degree, and at some point my flute teacher must have sensed something. I must have said something in lesson. She made me write a little piece of music, and that was it. I was done for. That kind of like grabbed my attention. But all the way through school, I was always behind. Even when I was doing the advanced degrees, they have these awful tests. They drop a needle on a record. Well, some of you know what the record is. It's the equivalent of dropping a needle on a CD. Does that make sense? Randomly starting. They play a minute, and I didn't know the repertoire, and it just took me forever to pass those exams. But the thing was, I kept at it, and I found music so fascinating that I just kind of kept working at it. And the composing took over. I became more and more fascinated, and I kept my head down. I studied music as much as I could. People told me all along I couldn't do it. I kept hearing that all the time, but it's unreal. Yeah, I know. I often say, how did I get to Curtis? That's the one I'm often wondering about. I'm amazed at the trajectory, but I often tell students, look, you're probably further along than I was at your age, which means you can do it, because I didn't ever exhibit any extraordinary talent as a kid. I didn't. I don't have perfect pitch. I wasn't running around humming things. I wasn't even asking for a violin or anything. It kind of happened, but I'm a truly late starter. I mean, an extraordinarily late starter, so. I think yes.
Yes, coincidentally, you touched on the very subject I was going to ask you about. You and Aaron Copland both had a late start.
Yeah.
That's pretty good company to be in, of course.
He's great company.
But I was wondering, can you compare having a late start, and most composers do have kind of an earlier start. Can you list some of the advantages and, if any, some disadvantages to getting that later start?
The disadvantages to later start is running across that barrier of discouragement, because all your classmates, they know what they're doing, and you're going off to the library. Listen, they're going to the football game and you're going to the library, which on a university campus sometimes is kind of a lonely place on football game day, It's, in a way, it was hard, but the thing is, because I wanted it so much and I found it so fascinating, the struggle didn't matter so much. It did make it harder, to be quite honest. I mean, some of my teachers didn't understand that I really was trying to make up ground where most people would come in and have a basic knowledge. I didn't have a basic. When I went to school, I didn't know the Beethoven symphonies. Can you believe that? I can't believe it. I'm saying it now, and I can't believe that's coming out of my mouth. I'm hoping that makes me a better teacher, because I'm empathetic with students who come in who maybe have more ground to cover, and so I keep that in mind. The big advantage is I don't have the same assumptions that a lot of people who started very young, who were practicing a lot, or maybe they became bored. I never had any sense of boredom at any point in any of my schooling. At any point. I just was kind of eating up voraciously. I also sometimes wonder if my sense of timing in music is different than some of my colleagues who started with classical pieces right off the bat. My music moves at quite a clip, and I think that may be the fact that I grew up in a household where there was more pop music playing. My need for a distinct pulse, the need to communicate, I think has helped me. But I would think someone who studies brains in psychology would have to really look at that because, I'm within my own world, so I can't step outside and explain how I differ from other people. So I'm making a guess, but it would be interesting if someone could actually look at that at some point. But hunger is the key here. It really is. If you're hungry for something and you don't lose that hunger because you feel like you're trying to catch up, that pushes you forward. It's a fantastic, powerful experience. In fact, I have a little piece of I think it was a little sticky note on my computer that says, "Stay hungry." I look at that every day. I'm like, yeah, stay hungry. Let's see if I can challenge myself today. And it makes life so engaging. No matter what your art form, no matter what you do, I think that staying hungry it's absolutely everything. Do you want to go back to your question, your second question, or? Sure. Okay, a microphone is coming your way.
My second question was, what happened to the spirit of improvisation in classical music? And is that changing now, or starting to change, or coming back?
That's a huge question. That's you know what? Improv has moved more into the jazz realm. It's not completely gone from classical music, but it is a lot more absent than it used to be, I think, historically. Is that your impression also?
I think so. However, I would point out that for fans of the Arkansas Symphony here, we've had two big improvisation works on this past season. One where the orchestra improvised for a good 15 minutes of an improvised cadenza by Daniel Bernard Romain.
Oh, yeah.
And also Justin Bischoff, an international organ soloist, came through town and did a 10-minute improvisation on an original theme of the day. So it is alive, but it's mostly alive in bastions of people where people are interested in it and keeping it alive. How has improvisation played a role in your works specifically, or maybe in the conception or design in your approach to work?
Actually, I don't have a lot of spots for improvising because normally the people I'm writing for say, don't write me anything where I have to improvise. I mean, it seems to inspire panic, genuine panic. But I do have a couple of pieces where I have cadenzas where percussionists are always willing to improvise. I've discovered whenever I've written percussion things, you can just tell percussionists, go to town, have fun, and they can go as long as, you're turning the lights out in the building and they're still improvising. Everyone's going home and they're still improvising. So when I wrote my percussion concerto, it was interesting. The percussionist was like, oh, you got to leave a room, cadenza for me to improvise. When I asked Hilary Hahn if she wanted that freedom, she was like, no way. She said, write the thing out. But I've also written a bluegrass concerto where the group is very skilled at improvising, but we knew we needed to keep the concerto under control as to how much duration the thing needed to be. So I did something where I would allow two of the players to play a regular beat, and I wrote that out, and then I would allow 16 bars for someone to improvise. So I think that improvisation may be coming back. Judging from the number of courses I see in universities that they're starting to offer this as a possibility, and I would love to see more of it, actually, because it's kind of freeing to step away from the page, not be following a note for note.
We're actually currently in the process of commissioning a work for jazz guitar and orchestra as a concerto in a New Orleans jazz style. So there are movements out there to bring this back, but another answer to your question, I think, if I might add a bit, is I think what we're really seeing also is just indicative of the pedagogical, what exists in classical music pedagogy today, which is that classical musicians are typically not comfortable with it, they're not trained in it, they're not schooled in it, and when asked to do it, it's so unfamiliar and so outside their comfort zone that often gets the opposite of effect that you referenced at the beginning of the talk here, which is that you try to set the musicians up to be comfortable and to buy into something, because that's always going to make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. That's how you make a great performance. So that being said, the other comment you made about knowing your orchestra, the Philadelphia Orchestra with a timpanist who like to play down in the percussion section. There are orchestras, I'll just mention ours. Our timpanist is also plays in a klezmer band and improvises on accordion. So, by knowing the orchestra, there are opportunities, of course, where improvisers are where they're resident within the orchestra. It can happen. I want to follow up on that question as well, where you talked once again about your students, and while you may only teach 2 hours a week at Curtis. It must be a very important place for you, and it must be, in some ways, an influence on you. And I'm curious how the practice of teaching, or maybe the interactions with your students, has influenced your craft and influenced your approach to composition?
I think that being a teacher helps you learn to articulate things. When the student comes in and says, I can't figure out how to write the sonata, that's usually the first statement that comes. I can't figure out how to write such and such, and having to sit down and try to get them past their psychological barriers, because when you're being creative, half of the battle is a psychological one. So you learn how to analyze how to help that person, but also trying to verbalize the things, the practices you do, and trying to get over the same psychological barriers, because anyone who's creative has those barriers. It helps a lot, strangely enough. I also find it inspiring to be at Curtis, even though I teach composers, to be around all those performers. It stuns me when I hear them practicing. It's at such a high level. This Concerto for Orchestra has a hysterical example. I was teaching a class at the time I wrote that piece, and the second movement is just the strings, and it starts off with all this pizzicato, pretty fast pizzicato. And I had originally written something where people were playing a lot of notes where they were just plucking really fast over and over, and I thought, this looks like this could hurt someone, literally. It would wear them out. So I went into my class, and I took some of the music with me, and I asked the students, I said, this looks dangerous for string players. Is it dangerous? And they said, ooh, that looks really not like a good idea. I said, well, how would you suggest I would make this more practical for the players? And
piece playing out in front of you, or the connection between the text and music in your opera. And, it's
you know, it actually shows, though, how, in truth, all the pieces that we love come about from practical needs within the music community. I mean, it's strange, we don't think about that. Someone may have intended to write something that was really impossible to play, but some musician came up to you and said, oh, you're out of your mind, I can't do that. And so if you actually have to continue the conversation and say, well, how would you suggest I do that? It's amazing how much you would learn. It is pretty amazing.
One thing that separates composers from the rest of classical music, conductors, performers,
There's probably some
musicians.
You're right.
Yeah. So we all walk into a bar.
Yeah.
No.
And the composer has to pick up the tab, right? That's the first thing.
We'll talk about that after the concert on Saturday.
Yes.
Our art form is often a little bit fleeting or ephemeral, whereas yours is enduring.
Is it enduring?
And I wonder if, well, that's an open question for you. What does that mean to you, writing for a performance, but knowing that in an ideal world,
right,
that piece will have a life far beyond the rest of us?
You would hope that that's the case, although in reality, for most of the pieces that get written, they get premiered and then they drop off the map, so to speak. I don't know. I never think of it like that, because I realize that I have to have you and the orchestra to bring the little pieces of paper alive, the little notes. It's really hard for me to do my job without the performers, so I'm heavily dependent on the performers. And so I'm constantly aware of that, which is one of the reasons I think, you know what, let's make this so that it works for the ensemble, because if they feel good about the experience and it works for them and their instruments, even if they have to practice it a lot because it's hard, then most likely that piece will get done again. But I never think about things lasting down the road, because I figure there's no way to predict this. I know that there are currently, right now, 10,000 composers working in the United States. 10,000 living composers in classical music. This is not pop music, classical composers. Were you aware there were that many? It's a stunning number, isn't it? You realize, though, when you hear that number, and I know this because I'm on a board at ASCAP, that's one of the performing rights organizations, you realize how much music doesn't get out there. And it's quite an unreal sort of experience to have that revelation, like, what are all these people writing then? Now, sometimes when you work in the choir world and the band world, a lot of those pieces get done. So I'm often in the situation where I'm with the orchestra world and I'm saying, hey, can you check out this composer and this composer? I try to keep tabs on what people are doing. But I also never make the assumption, because I know history has been loaded with composers. I mean, Bach wasn't the most popular composer when he was writing. Telemann was. And now we do Bach and a little Telemann, but yeah, so I think there's no way to kind of have your finger on the pulse of history. But I also think it's probably a waste of time to worry about that. And I'm so busy usually writing the next piece, I just don't even think about it. I just put my head down and write the next piece.
Have you ever been approached about composing a film score? You talked a little bit about enduring. A lot of the public, their exposure to music comes through a form like a movie.
Actually, most of the classical music consumed in the United States is video games and movies.
Yeah.
Most people don't know that, but that's
So have you ever
actually-
been approached, or would you ever consider doing a film score, or is that too restrictive?
No, I would do it in a heartbeat. I have been asked by, when I was younger and going through school, I had students in film schools ask me, but I was doing so many projects that I wasn't able to take anything on. But I would absolutely love to, because I'm a big fan of film, and I would love to give it a go. It would be great. It is shocking to know, though, that the majority of classical music is consumed in film and video. It's kind of a surprising sort of statistic.
And we have time for one more quick question.
Yes, listening at you speak about your career, it sounds as if after you got out of academia, you had an absolutely sort of charmed and blessed career. What I was wondering is, have you never had to face negative criticism of any of your compositions?
Oh, yeah.
How did you handle that?
I'm a composer. Not only that, I'm a living composer.
Reviews the criticism. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Actually, I think if you're any artist working in this world today, you're going to get criticism. There's no such thing as all good reviews. There's one critic in LA that just, my name appears on a program and he's already writing about it. He just goes after me. And to the point where he ignores the orchestra, the soloist, and everyone else. It's like a rant. I think the truth is, this is going to sound strange, but I have enough performances where I don't read those things at all. I have an assistant who reads them, because that's someone's take on what I'm doing from the outside, and I know what I need to be doing from the inside out. And I think that it's not necessary to take that in, because I think it could really weigh you down. I've seen artists be completely crippled by that sort of thing. And you can often tell if you do look at them. I had a New York Times critic once said, he was reviewing my percussion concerto, and he actually said, "She's suspiciously prolific." And I thought, what does that mean? I have a composer in the closet writing pieces along with me. It's a stunt double in composition. But I think it's just not worth paying attention to that, because there will always be someone who says you can't do something, you shouldn't do something. And to me, art is the complete opposite. It's like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and do it. It only took someone telling me that to get me to actually say, all right, I'm going to do it. So when you're making art, I think that's a very important thing. Press forward.
And as we come to the end of our time here this afternoon, I wanted you to have the last word. And what do you, as the present of composition, a big part of the present composition in the United States particularly, but worldwide, also being young and being a big part of the near future of composition, but also being connected to students, the future possibly even after that. How do you feel about the future of classical art music composition?
I actually feel really good about it, because I realize we are at a point in time where there are more styles being written now, more different languages that people are writing, whether it's dissonant or consonant. I mean, there have never been this many varied styles out there for small ensembles, large ensembles, choirs, bands. It's probably the best time to be exploring, because if you don't like my music, there's someone else's music I guarantee you will love. You just have to experience as much as possible, and it's around you. And most people never think about this, but you hear new compositions every day. You turn on the radio, you turn on the TV, the commercials, the music that plays maybe at a bus stop, in a restaurant. Those are all written by composers. You like some of those songs, you don't like some of those songs. It's exactly the same in classical music, and there's a ton of music getting made. I'm often just incredulous, but I'm also extremely encouraged. So I feel really good about it.
That's fantastic to hear, and I want to thank you for joining us today. Her Concerto for Orchestra will be performed at 8 o'clock on Saturday night at the Robinson, and again it's Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock. And if you're not able to attend this weekend, our River Rhapsodies series that's right across over at the Clinton Library in the Grand Hall there will be performing 2 more chamber works of Jennifer. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank all of you. Thank you.